For me, everything I did to do with the camera, to do with editing, was useful experience and stuff that paid off when I came to actually make features. And really everything you do, you learn from, in terms of any time you're shooting something, a short film, particularly short film. When you try to write the script for a short film, it's very difficult to write a short film. I think in some ways it's harder than for a feature, to have a complete idea in just a few minutes and have a beginning, a middle, and an end, have an appropriate conclusion. So you learn a lot about narrative structure doing shorter films. But really every job I did, including corporate videos and industrial training films and things where I'd have to go to a company and throw up some lights and shoot interviews with executives and things like that. You're always learning about your craft. You're always learning about, how to balance the pragmatic requirements, the race against time, using the equipment you've got in a short space of time to sort of get something that you can use. It's all useful experience. When you're starting out, particularly, you have to play to your strengths. You have to do something that really excites you, and whatever's different about that. And in the case of following the non-linear structure was a somewhat unusual choice. But it's those things that are the strength of the project. It's the things that you can bring to what you're doing or bring to the filmmaking craft that maybe not everybody else is doing, maybe not everybody else can do or is thought to do. That's what's going to distinguish the thing. So it might seem in some ways more difficult, or seem like something that would make the project more difficult to sell when it's finished, what have you. But for me, I think the answer was definitely to try to play to my strengths and the things that I personally was passionate about. I think working in films today, it's an era where people tend to watch films more than once, even if they don't like them. You'll see it in the cinema on its first release, perhaps, and then you'll see it on cable television, or television you'll watch it on an airplane or in a hotel room or something, or it winds up eventually on regular TV. And so I think my generation of filmmakers understood really there's a responsibility to try and make something that has layers, something that has more to it the second time you see it, or some different aspect to it. And I chose to take the path of incorporating that desire for a layered approach into the narrative itself, into the story, if you like. And so I've made films that have some ambiguity to them or some layering to them narratively, so that if you see them a second time, you're going to watch them in a slightly different way. That was my approach. There are other filmmakers who approach it from a purely visual point of view, where they would just create very dense visuals that would sustain multiple viewings because you'd sort of see more in the frame.
I think when I first read Chris's draft of Dunkirk, it was scary and exhilarating, because normally he's a heavily dialogue-oriented scriptwriter, so you're always pushing the narrative forward through dialogue, whereas Dunkirk was very, very little exposition, and it was going to be a very visual film, and the visual storytelling is what was going to make this film worth watching. And of course you layer on top of that the intersecting timelines, which Chris loves to play with time. You get this kind of war movie like no other, which is not reliant on carnage and blood in the camera and all that kind of thing. It's reliant on a level of suspense that Chris said earlier that he wanted to maintain. He wanted to run this feeling of your heart beating away right from the first frame of image. You're starting to get tense, and that first gunshot, boom, you're tense pretty well all the way through the movie. And it was very experimental. When I read the script, I was thinking this could be a $100 million art movie and probably be the end of all of us, but thankfully it wasn't. The land, air and sea concept was built into the script, but of course when you're in post-production and editing, where those points changed and converged and where you allowed the audience in on the multiple timeline gags were all controllable. So we spent a lot of time perfecting where we moved from land to air to sea and back again. Probably in the first construction it was quite confusing, because a lot of times you went back and you'd been away from one of the components for too long a period, so you'd be sort of thinking, I'm not sure where I am or what's happening. And then it was just a matter of continuous processing to get it to the point where we felt the audience could sit through this reasonably complicated pathway, still enjoy it, and even if a few of them didn't quite catch what was happening, they'll catch up with it. Good confusion versus bad confusion. So that was something that, you know, we tested and tested and tested amongst ourselves and with some close friends who weren't related to the film. We did a lot of screenings of Dunkirk until we thought we had it exactly where we needed it.
For the practical side, we took 36 technicians out, combining of engineers, fabricators and floor technicians from the UK. And obviously Scott had quite a large team in the US. And we kind of all went out to France, and we kind of got that underway, and then we dispatched a little team to go out to Holland to start setting up out there. But it was amazing what, you know, we achieved in the amount of time that we had. You know, we literally had 8 weeks, you know, to get all that together. When we first started talking about it, we all we thought it was going to be another Saving Private Ryan, and you know, we need hundreds of guys. When we went out on the scout and Chris Nolan is specific exactly what he wanted, it all became quite clear that, you know, it was achievable, you know, for the amount of time that we had to do it. But it was a great experience.
Like Andrew said, all the stuff we do is really a collaboration, and from beginning to end, it's really working with the director, working with Chris, and trying to figure out his methodology of what he wanted to do. I mean, and then it kind of evolves as you go. The miniature planes are a good example, because early on, I think most of us thought those were going to be mostly CG, because there's no flying examples of a lot of those period planes. We did some research, we looked at other films, and Chris was really keen. He liked the look of that, and we knew what we could achieve with miniature planes. So then, you know, that evolved into that, and so we kind of would have a lot of different meetings about, you know, the type of stuff that we needed to provide to make sure we were covered for every shot, as far as, you know, not just one aspect, that's just the miniature planes, but that would go through for, you know, originally we first started, we talked about doing a bunch of pyro stuff for these big explosions that were needed in the water, but then once we got to France, you know, we weren't going to be able to do that. They kind of said that we couldn't do the pyrotechnics in the water, so then we thought maybe it would become a visual effect, but then worked with Paul and his guys, and we figured out a way to do it with pneumatic cannons, and we did it. But it was like each effect kind of, as it comes up, you know, there's that same collaboration of how it could be achieved through visual effects or practical effects, and then what the directors asked for, and then what we can provide. And if it's not quite what we need, then that's where Andrew's team will take over and kind of add a bit to it. Or
we allow for being able to build everything pretty much as a full CG asset. You know, we photograph all of and scan all the planes and the ships, and so we were able to build a complete full CG version of everything. And in fact, we did use bits of them on the side of the planes, and to stop the propellers spinning when the engine was supposed to be stalled, and undercarriage coming up and down. And there are CG pieces of all those planes, but in a way, it's like it allows us to go into the shoot and try and achieve as much as we can in camera. And it turned out that on this film, really, there's only very few shots that have a full CG plane. They're usually quite small in the background, but the vast majority.
We built some of the highest resolution models I've ever seen on a show, and they get used very minimally. But if we didn't have them, we wouldn't be able to do like these small corrections. So while it might seem like a huge overkill to have all of these planes built to IMAX resolution, which is, you know, that's a huge resolution. We couldn't do simple things like using a flopped plate, which then puts all of the numbers and all the signs on the planes the wrong way around. We can use our high-res models to unflip all of the call sign numbers on the sides of the planes and all that kind of thing.
Adding the tails to all of the gimbal shots, like all of the close-up shots of the pilots flying the plane were shot on a gimbal that Scott's team built in America, and we had the idea of shooting it on the cliff next to the ocean so we could have the real horizon in the background. But the gimbal cockpit was quite short, so whenever we had shots that looked down the side, we needed to add the whole back of the plane in the back of the shot. And again, we were able to use those really high-res models to extend the plane.
Yeah, again, every film's different. So on Dunkirk, it was really going in to sort of study it because it was such a well-known event. We realized within a week of sitting down at his house that he'd already written the script. It was the shortest script he's ever written, and so we kind of sat there. We looked around. It's like, we've got to get on a plane, go to Dunkirk. So I actually met him in Dunkirk very early on, and we decided we'd just walk the whole beach. So we walked 18 miles. We kind of realized we couldn't fake any of it. We had to actually go and shoot in Dunkirk, and we had to do as much of it practically as we could, even though Dunkirk's it's a difficult beach to film on, because it's a difficult beach to get off, because it's got a 21-foot tide. It's very particular to the event, and so we immediately knew, even though it was going to be very hard to make the film there, we had to go and make it there. So that's kind of how it started. Then we went back to his house and we spent a couple of months just trying to figure out how to achieve everything, how to do it with as little VFX as possible. How do we do the flying stuff? How do we do the boats? And so we sort of came to the sort of further realization we had to build an armada of big ships and little ships. So then I actually took off and went kind of around most of Europe looking for ships. Looking for the hospital ship, which came out of Norway, the Rogaland. I was looking for destroyers, working destroyers, minesweepers. So we had to build this armada. So it was a very difficult film to try and make practically. So we had to one, find planes, two, decide how we were going to do all the ships, whether we were going to scale them down, whether we're going to use half-scale ship. Now, half-scale destroyer is 180 foot long, so you can use a boat that's much smaller, and then you have to build the scenery on the decks and make it seaworthy to make a full-size destroyer at over 150 feet. So we sort of came up with all these sort of practical ways of achieving the film. I mean, we were not doing anything new. They've been doing it pre-visual effects for donkey's years. So how do we put an IMAX camera on a World War II plane and fly it in formation and capture that on film? There was a lot of enormous amount of practicalities, and that kind of, to begin with, overrode the design theme. And then, as we got further into it and we looked at other research, we realized that Dunkirk, everyone sees it as this sort of little, 3-story seaside town, but actually it was a big industrial port. So we really want to play with the industry and the bleakness of the other side of Dunkirk, which kind of played into our film, this lonely place, inescapable place.
That approach of covering yourself for anything that we weren't able to achieve allows you to actually try and do more on set, because you always have that fallback going for a CG solution if you need to. I think it was really important for the feel of the sort of style of aerial battle tactics in that era. So we did a lot of research and reading and watching archival footage about that. So it's very good to inspire the choreography, if you like, of the battle scenes.
I think he was quite keen to avoid super quick dogfight, sort of Star Wars style dramatic fly-throughs, and keep it quite close to, there's a lot of archive footage out there of what these dogfights were like, and it's quite tense. They're slowly tracking around on the enemy planes and lining them up on the sites. And
it's sort of combination of very long, slow turning action, and then very fast sort of maneuvering if you're going towards each other.
Definitely looked at like some of the films and what had been done in other films and what had been done CG, and he definitely didn't want to go down that route. So that's why I think was one of the other main reasons for the planes as well. Yeah,
there was a really strong sort of thing that we really wanted to avoid, was ever having a camera in a place where it felt like you couldn't have shot that for real. So we really wanted everything to feel like you could have put a camera in one plane and filmed another plane passing. So that was a very strong directive for the whole film, really, is to never have that.
I've been greatly influenced by filmmakers of the past, hugely. I always point to George Lucas's first Star Wars film as a seminal influence on me. It was the first film that I remember that really just opened up the possibilities of what you could do with movies. Ridley Scott has always been a tremendous influence on me. I've loved the worlds he's created, the textured quality of those things. Terrence Malick is a huge influence, and Stanley Kubrick is a filmmaker that I've always greatly admired, although he's one that's difficult to try and imitate or learn too much from specifically, but as an inspiration, just as a great genius of cinema. And then more recently, specific to Dunkirk, I think, the cinema of Alfred Hitchcock, Clouseau, filmmakers working in the suspense genre were very important to me. I've also been very influenced by silent filmmakers. I go back to the work of Fritz Lang and Murnau, von Stroheim, those visions, those ideas of what movies could do before dialogue came in, before our contemporary narrative structures sort of came in. I find going back to that older form of storytelling in movies to be very inspiring. I think really the only useful advice I ever got in terms of, trying to figure out your way into the film business, the film industry, is to get yourself a script and hang on to it. It's that idea, that screenplay, that concept, whatever that's going to be, that's so important. And you have to stick to your guns. You have to find something that you can do that maybe other people couldn't do. And even if that seems different or doesn't fit into people's expectations, that's what's going to distinguish it if you can do it successfully. So I think it's really about sticking to your guns and, doing something that you passionately believe in rather than trying to appeal to some desire that you imagine other people have for what they want to see in a film. I think you have to be true to your own passion and your own sense of what excites you as a storyteller.